Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all for coming to this talk. I am, as Emil said, Nicklas Brendborg. I'm a PhD student at the University of Copenhagen, and then I am also a science author. So this book, which is called Vanedyr in Danish, Super Stimulated in English, is my second book. And the whole synopsis of the book is that we are in the middle of a whole host of health crisis. So we are in the middle of what's called the obesity crisis. We have every single year the most overweight cohorts ever. We are some of the most lonely people or generations that we have ever had statistics on, meaning people have fewer friends, they spend more time alone at home, and they also report feeling worse about their social situation. Then we have problems with mental health, especially stuff like anxiety, depression among young people, and we have various forms of addictions, all the way from the really bad ones like drug addictions and all the way down to the ones that are maybe a little more benign, stuff like having a hard time letting go of your phone and having the urge to scroll all the time. So all of these health epidemics, they sound like they are not really related. It sounds like all these different issues. But it turns out there's actually a common factor in all of them. And if we understand this factor, we can improve a lot of different health outcomes at once. So that's what I'm going to be talking about in the next 30 minutes. I've put questions as one of the topics. We probably won't have so much time for questions, but I'll stick around afterwards. So if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to come by, and I will stick around and answer everyone. So the first problem we're going to start with is the so-called obesity crisis. And I just brought this little overview, because when we are scientists and we look into obesity, in some of the newer studies, we look into stuff like what fat percentage do people have, how much lean mass do they have, so muscle and other tissue. But in the vast majority of studies, we still use what's called BMI, body mass index. I'm pretty sure a lot of you have heard about this before, but if not, it's basically just a measure that relates your body weight to your height. Of course, it's very important to know if someone is 2 meters tall, if they're 150, when we evaluate whether they are overweight or not. So I brought an average height Dane for men and women here, just so you can see approximately what BMI different weights would correspond to. Because if you plug your height and weight into this formula, you'll get a number out, that's your BMI, and if this number is 18 to 25, we say your normal weight. If it's 25 to 30, you're overweight, and if it's plus 30, then we call you obese. And the whole problem with gaining weight is really easily summarized from this slide, because in the vast majority of human history, practically everyone alive has been in the green area without even trying. But in most countries, in Denmark, for instance, back in 2017, we had a kind of sad milestone in that we now have more people in the yellow and the red category than in the green one. So the average Dane is now overweight, and these numbers are looking a little better than they actually should be, because it's easier to stay skinny and stay lean when you're young. So if we cut out the young people and only look at middle-aged people, so those between 40 and 65, we see that around 55% of these women are overweight, and for the men it's 70%. So here we have a health issue that is vastly more likely to strike you than to miss you. And this is in Denmark, which is actually one of the skinniest and leanest developed countries in the world. So in the vast majority of countries, stuff looks even worse. I brought you a little overview here where you can see the amount of the percentage of people who are obese in different countries. We start back in the middle of the 70s, and then when we start rolling around to the present day, we see that this is a global phenomenon. So actually a lot of people think, okay, obesity, that's something that is really bad in the US and sometimes also in Europe, but pretty much the rest of the world are fine, right? But actually, the real world evidence shows now that a lot of what's called middle income countries, so stuff like the countries in Latin America, in the Middle East, they actually have overtaken countries like Denmark. Some of them have even overtaken the United States, such as in countries like Egypt and probably soon also Mexico. You have more obese people than you have in the US. And even in the traditionally leanest part of the world, the poorest part of the world, Africa, south of the Sahara, we see this problem in that now in most parts of Africa, we have more overweight people than underweight people, and we are starting to also see more deaths that are due to overweight and obesity than due to lack of food. So this is in truth a global problem. When you look at these numbers, you might think, what is it that has gone wrong? Something must be seriously wrong, because in some of these countries, it's not like in Denmark. For instance, if you go to the Middle East and Latin America, in some of these countries, you see obesity practically hit in a single generation. So people will remember vaguely when they were young, everyone was skinny, and then when they reach middle age, vastly more than half the population suddenly weigh too much. And the first thing people usually say is, oh, that's an easy mystery to solve, because now we just become too lazy. A lot of us work behind the computer, and that's probably the reason why we keep gaining weight, because if we eat the same amount of food, well, then if we don't burn it for anything, we're gonna be gaining. However, this can't be the only or even the main explanation, because in countries like Denmark, we have really good what's called activity data. So we have used various devices back for several decades to measure how active is the average person. And we can actually see that back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, people were a lot less active than they are today on average. So perhaps more people are sitting down while they work now, but there's also more people that run and bike and go to the gym and do various kinds of exercise. So actually, we burn a little more energy on exercise in Denmark now than we used to do. So we should actually have been even more overweight if we didn't adjust our activity levels. That means there must be something else that is causing this change. And before we get to the solution to the riddle, we have to go on a little detour. We go back to the 50s, and here we meet a Dutch scientist called Nicklas Brendborg. And he was not interested in obesity. He was not even interested in humans. He was studying birds and their behavior. And in one of his experiments, he actually ended up winning the Nobel Prize. In this experiment, he took a little bird that normally lays these small, green, bluish eggs. Then he made a fake egg out of plaster, modeled on the natural egg, but just several times larger. Then he painted this egg with this really bright blue color. And when he took this really bright blue egg and put it into the cage of the bird, it took one look down at its own boring and small egg, one look at this absolute party of an egg, and then it tries to jump up onto this fake egg instead. It actually gets so into this egg that you have to physically remove it before the bird will have any want to go back to its own egg and shift its interest. So what is happening here? What is happening is what is called a supernormal stimuli. So a supernormal stimuli is an exaggerated version of what an animal is normally built to be interested in. So this bird is normally built to be attracted to the eggs that it has that are the largest and the ones that have the most color. Because the healthier the bird, the bigger and the brighter egg it can make. Then the problem just becomes that with modern technology, we can easily make something that's both bigger and much more richly colored than the bird could ever dream of making, but it has never had a reason to develop a ceiling to this instinct. So it just lives by the rule, the bigger and the brighter the egg, the better, and then you can easily trick it. Now you might sit there and say, birds are not the brightest, animals are pretty stupid, huh? But actually, it turns out that there's not any animals that get tricked more by this phenomenon than humans. So if we take a look at how our food has evolved through history, we started out 99% of our time as what's called hunter-gatherers. Here you get food by basically going into nature and taking back whatever you found. So that could be stuff like you go hunting, you go berry picking, you go collecting honey, and then you bring it back. Then in much of the world, a few thousand years ago, we had the next transition. We started being farmers, so we started doing agriculture. In Northern Europe especially, we started having more dairy products in our diet. But these two eras, what they have in common is that if we look at people that still live the way that we in the Western world used to do back in time, whether it was as a hunter-gatherer or as a primitive farmer, then we just don't see overweight or obese people. In these populations, we see a constant body weight level until the very end of life, where body weight actually falls a little bit as people lose their muscle mass and their bone mass. But then we have a third era in the modern world, and that era looks like this. Increasingly, we eat what's called ultra-processed food. You could call it food super stimuli. You could call it factory food. It's food that is made by a food company in a factory. The problem with this is not that a food is necessarily unhealthy because it touched a machine, but that when you're a food company, you have to follow the exact same economical rules as all other companies, meaning you have to earn as much money for your investors as possible. And that becomes a problem because when you are a food company, then that means your mission is basically to get as many people as possible to eat as much as possible of your food. So if people get full, that's not very good for business, and that means these companies will hire people like me to come and help them design their foods to be as irresistible as possible. So in my book, I have a long discussion about how we know this and how we can see that these scientists are really good at their jobs. But I found that when I do these talks, there is a very easy way to illustrate it. Because as we're going to talk a little bit about later, we have a tendency to adapt to any stimuli we are exposed to. That means when I look at you guys here, of course, there's no one here that never ever eats chocolate or candy or fast food or ready meals from the supermarket. And that means all of us have brains that have adjusted to these kinds of exaggerated stimuli a little bit. So if we want to see how they actually affect us, we have to see it through the eyes of someone who has never tried them before. So that's what I have here. Ice cream is, of course, a perfect example of a super stimuli, something that's made in a factory to be irresistible, and let's see how it affects us. So what you see here is a part of the brain called the reward system that just screams jackpot. Because it's not that our genetics have changed since we were hunter-gatherers or primitive farmers. We have the exact same mechanisms in our brains that are supposed to regulate our appetite so that we eat exactly the amount of food we need every single day. The problem just is that when you have this exaggerated or over-natural stimulation of the reward system, then another part of the brain might be saying, stop, you had enough calories already, but that just completely gets drowned out by this screaming by the reward system. Then you eat too much. When you eat too much for a few decades in a row, well, that quickly catches up and becomes 10, 20, 30 kilos of extra fat, even if it's just a little bit too much every single day. So let's look at how these companies do. If you want to make a food super stimuli, one of the best weapons you have is, of course, something as simple as sugar. That's one of the secrets behind this response. Humans have a long evolutionary history as apes eating fruit in the rainforest. And when you eat fruit in the rainforest, it's very good to be attracted to stuff that's sweet, because that means the fruit is ripe and that it's not poisonous. That means when we taste something sweet, we are instantly attracted to it. But then you can imagine us making this super stimuli change to the food. For instance, compare strawberries on one hand to candy with strawberry flavor on the other. What we've done with this candy is practically just say, what is the essence behind why a strawberry is attractive? Then we have isolated that and just exaggerated it in the form of just making the candy way, way sweeter than the strawberry could ever be. But if we really want to have this response, it turns out sugar alone is not enough. We also have to add fat. So if you combine sugar and fat, you reach what is called the bliss point in this kind of science. That's basically where if you make studies on humans or rodents and you vary the composition of a food, so more fat and more sugar and less fat, or to the other direction, everyone seems to hit approximately the same composition, where you can get like a perfect ratio of the two, and then you can see that people eat more than in any other composition. Then the third weapon you have at your disposal is to just add a lot of salt. So we're interested in salt because salt is necessary for our brains and our muscles to function. And that means that we have a tendency to like food that is a little salty. But this problem is also a good way to illustrate how much our food habits have changed, because the amount of salt that our drive to eat salty foods used to make us eat is approximately this, 1 gram. That's what our ancestors eat and what we approximately need in a day. Today, the average Dane eats approximately 8 grams of salt. That's the average intake for a Danish woman, and men are of course a little bigger, so eat approximately 10 grams because they eat a little more. And then the 20% highest intakes in Denmark is at 15 grams of salt a day. So of course, salt in small amounts is not a problem, as is small amounts of fat or sugar for that instance, but just when we get into this super stimuli territory where companies add huge amounts, then we start seeing health problems. This is of course only the tip of the iceberg, because you optimize the foods in tons of different ways, and we don't have time to talk about all of them. We go all the way down into optimizing the texture, optimizing even the sound of the food, so how it sounds when you bite into a chip, or how it sounds when you open a can of Coke, for instance. That's not a coincidence, that's also by design. Then these companies also try to make it, as I said, so that we don't get full when we consume their products, because if you get full, then you kind of stop eating. There's again a few different weapons you can use. You can make sure there's no fiber in your food. You can make sure there's no protein. You can make sure that physically it doesn't take up a lot of space, because our stomach is programmed to make us stop eating once our stomachs are full to a certain amount. And then you can play on our instinctual drive to have variety. But this also means that you can do experiments where you try to do the opposite of what these food companies do. You can try to make people as full as possible from as little food as possible. That's what these scientists have done. They're Australian scientists. They invited thousands of students to come into their lab, gave them 300 calories of a single food source, so everything from chocolate bars to oranges or apples, and then they asked them for a couple of hours, how hungry do you feel right now? In this data, we find, not surprisingly, that cakes and sweets and white bread and all this factory food that is made to not be filling and that is made to be really appealing, it makes you hungry fast again. So it's the least filling food there is. But then we can see that generally the less processed the food is, the more you get full, and even among these foods, we see that it's especially one food that is more filling than all other foods, and this food is potatoes. So there was an Australian guy that read this study, thought that his whole problem with his weight was due to the fact that he was always consuming these foods that never filled him up. And then he decided to do the exact opposite and take a whole year where he lived on nothing but potatoes. In this year, he could eat exactly how many potatoes he wanted. He could eat whenever he felt like it, but he could only eat potatoes. It turns out that this is a really, really effective way to lose weight. It's not something I would recommend to anyone, but I thought I wanted to try it for myself, just as a little experiment in a single week. And I can tell you it works really, really well. So I had no desire to actually lose weight, but it turns out a person my size needs to eat between 2.5 and 3 kilos of potatoes a day just to keep my weight stable. I was not able to do that in any way, shape, or form. And even though I got further and further into caloric deficit, I definitely didn't feel like eating more. Quite the contrary, I started just eating fewer and fewer potatoes as this week progressed. So that's not something I would recommend anyone actually try. But the point here is that we might have a really serious global problem, but in theory, not necessarily in practice, but in theory, we have a really easy solution. If you eat more unprocessed foods, it turns out you have to eat enormous amounts of food just to get the caloric intake that you need to keep your weight stable. If I then needed to gain weight, maybe I should have eaten 3.5 kilos of potato, and of course, that's not humanly possible for very many people. So in practice, this is not always so easy, but in theory, we have a great solution. Now, I want to also talk briefly about the other types of superstimuli I go through in my book. So we have superstimuli for our drive to eat. We have some for our reproductive drive, so for sex. That's what happens on dating apps. It's what happens in pornography. We have what I call chemical superstimuli. Stuff like various drugs are basically just superstimuli where you can really activate the reward system of the brain. And then the last one I want to talk about is what I call digital superstimuli. But before we dive into this, we have to get a little more science in place. We have to go back to the 50s again. This time we meet a psychologist, not a biologist. He's called B.F. Skinner, and he is the inventor of this box that we call the Skinner box. In this box, there is a button or a lever or something that a rodent can press. Then when you take this rodent and put it into the box, rodents are really curious, so they will instantly start touching stuff. They will instantly start sniffing stuff. That means at some point they're going to press this lever or button or whatever it is that you put inside the box. That will release a treat for the animal. It could be a treat such as just a little bit of sugar, because both mice and rats, just like humans, love sugar, and then they kind of get a reward. Once you have done this a few times, the animal learns the connection, so they will actively start pressing the button, taking the treat, pressing the button, taking the treat, and you kind of learned them this little mechanism. But Skinner was not interested in just teaching animals how to do a funny little trick. He was interested in seeing how could he make these animals just completely obsess about this button. And he found out he could do that if he switched to what's called a variable reward system. So he kept changing the level of the reward, so that sometimes when these animals pressed, nothing happens. Sometimes when they pressed, maybe they get a tiny treat, and then a few times when they press, it just goes into complete jackpot mode and just spits out sugar treats for them. When this happens, some of these animals get so obsessed about this button that they will press once a second, so they basically just sit there like zombies again and again and again. Now, this is maybe the second time where you'd think, okay, animals are really stupid, huh? But it turns out that this is not just something that happens to animals. So what you're looking at here is not just something that was inspired by a Skinner box. It is literally just a Skinner box for people. The only difference is that the reward is something abstract in the form of money instead of food, but otherwise it's completely the same thing. Now, I spared you some of the worst of these videos you can find online, because there's videos like this where one of the people on the row suddenly grabs their chest and then collapses with a heart attack, and then there's just no one that moves even an inch. It's only when security personnel comes running from the other side of the casino and try to revive this person that there's any help for the poor soul. Some of these people also admit that they put on a diaper before they go and start gambling, because even having to go to the bathroom is not enough to break this trance-like state that they get into when they start gambling. Now, of course, there's an easily understandable reason why casinos design their machines like this, because when you play on a slot machines, the odds are stacked against you, meaning the further or the more time you play, the more money the casino earns. So the engineers at the casino basically had the task, now you have to take this relatively mundane thing, having to sit there and press a button, and you have to make it as exciting as humanly possible, because the more time people want to do it, the more money we earn. As most of you probably know, they have been really successful in this. They earn a ton of money, but they are nowhere near the companies that earn the most money from this, because increasingly a lot of us look like this. And this is actually the exact same mechanism happening in the brain. We know that for a fact because a lot of the early engineers in stuff like Facebook and in Instagram have all taken the same course at Stanford University called Persuasive Technology, where you basically just get taught what B.F. Skinner did in his scientific career and get some tips and tricks on how to convert that into a digital product. Some of them have also been out in public and admitted that this was the thing they did. This is how they designed their products. But we can even also just conclude it if we think about what happens, for instance, if you open something like TikTok. Once you open TikTok, you see a video that's kind of like doing your first play on the slot machine. Then maybe it's not interesting. You can do a simple physical thing to go play again, not pressing a button, but scrolling. And you can keep maybe getting videos that are not the most interesting, but sometimes you'll hit something that is just absolutely hilarious, something that is really interesting. Maybe just a person that you think is really attractive. That gives this little jackpot feeling, and then you keep on playing and you get into this trance-like state where I'm sure most of you have tried by now. If you're on some of these apps, maybe you open it to respond to a message or just get a 5-minute break. Suddenly 1 hour, 2 hours have passed and you've just been sitting there mindlessly scrolling. So you could call that the conquest of our attention, because social media is designed this way because, again, you earn money by keeping us around. You earn money by showing us ads. So the more time we sit there and do something that is, again, kind of mundane, sitting in your sofa and just doing the same thing again and again, well, the more money the social media companies earn. The first thing they have done to create this product is to make a super stimuli for acknowledgement. We humans love when people give us praise, when people tell us that we are doing something well, and that is what you get when you have the like function, and increasingly also in stuff like views on TikTok and Instagram Reels, where if you're out in the real world, maybe a few people will come by and say, oh, you look nice today, it's really interesting what you said at the meeting. But when you post on social media, you can get recognition from hundreds of people in a very short time span, just compressed, kind of like how we compress a lot of sweetness into a single piece of candy. Then you can do the same with acknowledgement into the social media post or feed. We can see that this works. This is data from an American study where the scientists looked at what happens if people have a TikTok post or a Reddit post that get more recognition than usual. And basically what happens in this circumstances is that immediately after people will start being online more, they will start posting more. So everyone who works at these companies that have dared to go public says that this is already included in the algorithm, such that they constantly try to dose these forms of acknowledgement so that you will keep using the product. Then there is at all times an algorithm that also makes other kinds of experiments on you. You should know that both Facebook and Netflix have been out there saying, no matter when you use this service, you should be pretty sure that you're part of some kind of experiment. That means it's not only the content that they do experiments on, it's basically everything from the buttons to what text to what combinations of content that they show you. And there's actually been studies where they can prove that they can affect your mood, they can affect your political opinions, all by just making sure that they are very thorough about what videos they show and in what combination. And then the last little trick you could use is that they simply used very bold colors. So it doesn't all have to be about this high-tech algorithms. It could be something as simple as making sure your screen looks like this, because it just turns out, once again, humans are just an evolved version of a monkey that was eating fruits in the rainforest. And it's good to be able to taste stuff that is sweet when you're this kind of monkey, but it's also very good to be able to see color, because when a fruit is ripe, it doesn't only go sweet, it also go bold and bright. That means we have some of the best color visions among mammals. We love dressing ourselves and our surroundings in colors, but we also can be persuaded to sit there and stare at a screen really easily if the colors are bright. That means that the companies have a bit of an Achilles heel because you can actually make your device look like this. And it turns out if you put your device into grayscale, then it just gets a lot more boring to look at. And that's actually the best way I found for myself to cut down on my screen time. Okay, so we don't have a lot of time left. The last I brought to you today is that now we know we get manipulated to eating stuff that maybe isn't the best for us. Now we also get manipulated into using our time in a way that maybe we would have wished not to. Does that have any consequences? And it does, definitely. One of them you can see here in a study that is done every 4th year on young Danes. In this study, they ask young boys and girls if they have been physically with a friend in the last week. We can see for all age groups there is a drastic fall. The same goes for the number of people that says they have been to a party in the month that just transpired, that have been to a concert, that have been to a sports event. And that's of course very simple to explain because at the same time screen time is going up and there's basically 24 hours in a day. So that means if you start being on your phone 3, 4, 5 hours more than you used to, then you have to get this time from somewhere else. At the same time, we can see that mental health problems are rising. They're not just rising in Denmark, they are rising in the whole developed world. It always happens in 2012 or 2013. There's still a lot of ongoing discussions about why this is, but of course the most simple explanation is the same one we saw for our food. We are now being manipulated, as I said, into using our time in a manner that maybe we would have wished not to. It's not so hard to think that maybe this way of being social online or having experiences online doesn't actually fulfill us the same and thus helps explain this trend. Okay, the last thing I brought today is that besides this book that I was just talking about, my first book is about aging and how we can defeat the aging process and live longer. In connection with this project, I have started a health clinic on Østerbro. In this clinic, you can get a full health analysis, so we will basically look at markers for your health of various different organs. Then we will tell you how you fare compared to your age, compared to your sex. We will give you specific advice for the stuff that you are bad at. We will also, of course, praise you for the stuff that you're doing well. And then we have some of the brightest medical students hired in our clinic that will help you make a plan to adjust the things that you are doing bad so that you can kind of build your health from the bottom. If you are interested in this, we actually brought some of the equipment. We have a little stand all the way here in the back. I will go there after the talk, so you're more than welcome to come by. We also have some books, but I think besides that, we do maybe have time for one question, if anyone dares to be the first one.
Sorry, det var tættest på. Here you go, man. Du skal tage den til... Ja, you're good.
Ja, den sidder der. Nå, jeg skal selvfølgelig med.
Søren der. Søren, vigtigt.
Okay, just a question regarding this, where at 2013, something happened and we have more mental illness. Do you think that perhaps the fact that we get all the dopamine rushes all the time could create some imbalances that makes that whole system go whack?
Yes, so that's a very good question, and unfortunately, I had to rush a little bit, so I didn't have time. I couldn't bring that, but we undergo what's called desensitization when we experience these kinds of rewards. As I said, you have to imagine your brain as like a machine that always tries to adjust to whatever world it finds itself in. And we also adjust to our rewards, so that if we get used to rewards that are all the way up here, then stuff that's down here is not interested anymore. Meaning that if you get used to Ben & Jerry's ice creams that have cookie dough and chocolate chips and caramel sauce all bundled into that, then suddenly normal ice cream is not as interesting anymore. And, eating a piece of fruit is just plain boring at that point. The same thing you can imagine with a lot of the social stuff, where some people will rather chase having thousands of maybe millions of people validate them online than going out and meeting 2, 3, 10 people in an evening. That's just not as interesting anymore.
We have a question over here as well.
Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. Very, very interesting. So if you were like the boss, the digital prime minister of Denmark, what would you do an age gap or an age limit for kids and smartphones? If yes, why would you do it? And if no, why would you not do it?
Yes, I would definitely do it. And one of the reasons is that we know that our brains are especially called vulnerable, but basically just developing when we're young, right? And stuff gets set in stone. So if we look to the food area, we know stuff like your tolerance for saltiness, like how much salt you need to get this feeling of reward is set pretty early in life. It's not something you're born with, it's something that's set in the first couple of years. Meaning that then if you have eaten more salt in this period, you will just practically for the rest of your life have a need to eat more salt to be able to taste it. We don't know how this relates or how this works when it comes to, for instance, this short form video content, but it's very easy to think that it's probably at least somewhat related, so that your attention span could be maybe permanently damaged if you've grown up for like always chasing these quick rewards, and you get a harder time actually paying attention for a longer time because that's just not interesting anymore.
One last question is okay?
Yeah.
Here you go, sir.
Hi, Nicklas. Super interesting. I was just curious, besides putting the screen to white and black, what else do you do?
Yes, there's a lot of things you can do. There's these apps that you can use, for instance, one called Freedom that will physically block you out. There are people, especially in Silicon Valley, that are taking the next step now and buying these little kind of cages where you can lock your phone in and it won't open until a set time. There's stuff like leaving your phone at home, not bringing it so much, completely getting out of apps that you have. For instance, I don't have TikTok because I can sort of justify having stuff like Instagram and Facebook and LinkedIn because it also helps me business-wise. But if there's not a business thing, then the easiest thing is always to, not be a user. But I think right after me, Imran is gonna talk. He is an expert also on this stuff, so I'm sure he will share some more on the topic. I think that was it from me. As I said, I will be all the way down here at my booth. If anyone is interested in more questions, want to know about this health clinic, you're more than welcome to come and ask. But otherwise, thanks for coming. I hope you learned a little bit.
Thank you so much.